Welcome to everybody. And today we are with the last leg of the LandCover6k final workshop. And we have today a set of presentations related to Europe and Africa. Before starting the presentation, a couple of announcements. One related to the final part, which is called Celebration of 7 Years Collaboration. This is open to everybody. It's not something related to a subset of people. So whoever feels staying along with us at the end, has the strength to stay along with us at the end. It's also Saturdays, obviously, but it's open to everybody. And so it will just be somehow a virtual getting together to also say a goodbye to the 7 years dynamics and colleagues. The second thing is that there has been a change in the authorship in one of the presentations. The second one, the Jed Kaplan and Ralph Fyfe, Europe ALCC reveals KK Hyde. Ralph is unfortunately ill, and so Marie-José will take over. Okay, so and with this, I think we can start with the first presentation, which is given by Nicki Whitehouse and Marc Vander Linden, and it's Europe land use at 6,000 BP.
Okay, so can you see this okay? The slide, yeah, yes. Okay, okay, yep. Thanks. So I'm going to be talking together with Marc Vander Linden on behalf of a large group of people who have been working on European land use at 6,000 BP. So just to give a little bit of context to this, the European landscape is hugely varied. And it moves from sort of semi-desert areas in Spain through to savanna, boreal evergreen forest, mixed temperate forest and temperate forest. So the area that we're dealing with is hugely ecologically varied and topographically varied, and that has some impact on the nature of the archaeology and what we're able to say and imply about land use. In northern areas, it's very much dominated by sort of much more open landscapes, peatlands especially, and sort of montane, and today substantially transformed landscapes. But of course, that's not always been the case in the past, but it's just to emphasize this variation really. When looking at the time period that we were interested in when we started this exercise, of course, the time period that we're looking at covers a transition to early farming in northern parts of Europe, but in southern parts of Europe and into the Mediterranean, farming had already been well established. So farming starts in the Middle East in 10,000 and earlier, moving up into Northern Europe and reaching the northern parts of Northwestern Europe by about 3,800. But in places like Fennoscandia, still not arriving fully until quite a long period later, with the exception with a few isolated pockets really. So it's within that context that we started this work, and our aim was really to initially map the location of sites for the time period and really start to understand the likely spatial extent of land use. Then we wanted to assign the land use categories, which are shown here. I'm not going to repeat them because I think we're probably familiar with them now. And once we'd done that, understand the spatial extent of the land use, we would also use expert knowledge to sort of calculate what proportion of the land was assigned to each category. And that component is still ongoing. We also wanted to compare the land use outputs with modelled outputs such as HIDE and ArchaeoGlobe, and finally to compare with other attributes, and that aspect of the work hasn't yet been done. You have to forgive me, my voice is very croaky at the moment, so I may have to take a bit of water every now and again. So this is just displaying the data set that was put together. So fairly early on, we decided that we couldn't use archaeological settlement data patterns, largely because of the challenge of putting such a large data set together within the time period. And we opted to use radiocarbon dates because they're grid referenced and they're usually high quality data associated with them, and they're relatively fairly easily available. So we accumulated almost 4,000 radiocarbon dates for the time period within a sort of 1,000-year window. And for each archaeological site, only one date was selected, and we did quite a lot of analyses to compare long-lived versus short-lived samples. The dates were then calibrated, and then we selected the dates which had a posterior density falling within the time bracket of interest, and that posterior density was either 75% or 90%. And those data points are shown on these two maps here. So the blue dots are showing the hunter-gatherer sites, and the red dots are showing the agricultural sites. And you'll see that the selection of sites is impacted by the posterior density value that is used. And we discussed this quite extensively, but the overall pattern of the data are the same. So we were fairly satisfied that we could progress on that basis. So sites were designated as hunter-gatherer, fisher forager, or agricultural sites on the basis of their material culture or on the basis of their subsistence evidence. We also did quite a lot of testing against settlement data, and this was done particularly by Marc, Vander, Linden as a way to establish whether we were essentially picking up enough of the data sets using the radiocarbon dates. And you'll see that there are some gaps within some of the areas, and we are aware that particularly as we go further south, the number of radiocarbon dates reduces, and particularly in parts of Eastern Europe. So these data were then transformed using kernel density estimates, and these were used to estimate the maximum extent of land use. And we used fixed bandwidths of 40 kilometers for farming communities and 60 kilometers for the foraging communities. Now, the Kde approach was chosen basically because of the non-normal distribution of the site data. So you tend to get these big clusters of sites and then much less so. I'm not going to explain into why we decided to go for the kernel density estimate approach, but I'm quite happy to answer questions. So these are the two outputs showing the posterior density at 0.75 and 0.90%. And you can see that the spatial distribution indicates, so this is for agriculture, it shows agriculture extensively distributed across Europe. It's also it's not continuous in all areas. And we certainly are aware that there are some regions where we probably undercapture the nature of the evidence. But we are able to be chronologically quite accurate because of the use of the radiocarbon dates. So generally speaking, what we have here is the mapping of land use agriculture, and these are all non-irrigated herbaceous ground crops with animals. I think it's probably important to emphasize that agriculture quite often can be quite ephemeral in terms of its evidence. It's also subject to the temporalities of domestication, and wild resources continue to be used very extensively. So it would be a mistake to think that agriculture is a really dominating factor in the land use at this time. We also looked at splitting the time windows, and this is because of this issue of the transition to early agriculture. So, for example, on the left-hand side, you can see the slightly earlier time frame. And if we look at places like the British Isles, there is a little bit of agriculture showing up, but essentially that's just part of the tail of the radiocarbon dates. But it's really only after 6,000 that we really start to see an impact across these areas. what looking at these two timeframes does allow you to do is to get a sense of the velocity by which some of these agricultural communities are moving across the landscape and expanding across different sites. So it's quite a useful process for understanding the whole process of the transition to agriculture and the changing nature of land use. This is the foragers output. On the left-hand side, we've got the single time frame mapped out. So you can see the areas, particularly of Northern Europe, showing these foraging areas. But again, once you start to split the time window up, as you can see on the right-hand side, you start to get a better sense of what the reality may have been. And we've potentially got a scenario where we've got foraging and agricultural groups living alongside each other, certainly on the continental areas, but perhaps also potentially within the island regions as well. In terms of the land use, these are largely they're foragers, and they're using a series of broad-based and aquatic resources, some of which are listed on the slide below. We also looked at mapping crop proportions, and we looked at the variety of crops that are being made use of. This is not a comprehensive synthesis, but we did try to cover many of the different ecological and climatic areas of Europe. There's quite a lot of variability. One thing to emphasize is there's no swidden or shifting cultivation likely. There are still some areas of debate around this, particularly in places like southern Germany and in the Swiss Alps areas. But generally speaking, much of the evidence suggests that we've got permanent plot cultivation. So if we look at this at a European scale, we've got varied use of plants. So cereals certainly dominate in the north, but it's important to emphasize that although cereals are present, there is a persistent focus on wild resources. And in some of these areas, people would have been seasonally mobile. If we look at areas of Eastern Europe, such as Poland, again, we've got cereals present, but wild plants tend to dominate still. And there's also evidence of the use of wild plants, which may be being cultivated, such as Chenopodium album. So there's quite a discussion to be had, I think, around the dominance between wild versus cereals. As we go further south, we start to see a greater variety, and perhaps part of this is down to the different ecological and climatic areas. So in the Iberian Peninsula, again, whilst we've got cereals, we start to get more legumes and oil plants, and particularly in the southern eastern parts of Europe, in the Balkan Peninsula, for example, we've got an increased importance of legumes and a lot of inter-site variation, presumably because households and communities were growing crops that were reflective of their own particular circumstances. So we've got a lot of variation here happening, but I think the thing to emphasize is its permanent plot cultivation and extensive use of wild plants alongside cultivation. If we look at the animal evidence, again, we've got significant variation of animal usage. So for example, if we look in Northern Europe, places like the Netherlands, we've got high dominance of cattle, but also pig, but these are probably minor components overall. Wild animals still continue to be hugely important. If we go a little bit further east, it starts to become a little more mixed, but again, there's considerable regional variation, with some areas with more cattle dominated, some more sheep goat, presumably reflecting local pasture availability, although it should be emphasised that in the case of cattle, it's most likely to have been grazed within closed woodland or very sort of fairly relatively open woodland, but not necessarily in large pasture areas. As we go further south, we've got the arid areas of Iberia, and here we've got sheep and goat dominated. although that might be slightly biased because some of these assemblages are coming from caves. But if we look at places like the Pyrenees, we've got greater dominance of greater increase of use of things like cattle. Wild species continue to be used, and we've got a close integration of wild versus domesticates. If we look at Eastern Europe, Southern Eastern Europe, we've got a much more mixed picture, with sheep, goat more important in arid areas and mountains, and cattle in more temperate areas. And a lot of these different mixtures seem to be determined at the settlement level, presumably in part dictated by local environment, but perhaps also dictated by local local choices at the individual household level, and perhaps the beginnings of specialization, which then emerge much later on in the next millennium or so. All of these different animal combinations, of course, also have different pasture requirements, and we might want to think about how those might affect the land use values. Okay, so I'm now going to pass over to my colleague, Marc.
Thank you very much, Nicki. So what you have here is actually the outcome of all the work that Nicki just presented, but as it looks using the LandCover6k grid. So as a reminder, each grid square is assigned to a given land use category, and it's based on the kernel density. And when you have those areas where you have this overlap between farming and hunter-gathering, either as an outcome of the fact that we are going through that transition, or potentially because you have communities living side by side, what we've done here, or actually what has been done by Chad Hale, to be more precise, is to go for a grid system, which comes across as this kind of more gray area that you can see, for instance, in Britain or other parts of Northwestern Europe. What we've also done is, for the areas which are falling outside of the kernel density, we've decided to assign these as minimal, rather than just totally devoid of land use. This is mostly for two reasons. First, we cannot assume that there are no people, and also it's a way of encapsulating the uncertainty in the way that we've been working, in the sense that really you have to remember that we are mostly working on C14 data. Therefore, that leaves us room also to modify the data collection and adjust those areas, but also add further notice to take into consideration other constraints like wetland, geology, soil, and so on. The two things that are really key to recognize is that agriculture is largely widespread in all areas, with the exception of much of Vander Gaillard, which is echoing what is well known in the literature. Another thing is that these are really areas where the land use is practiced. It does not say anything about the actual amount of land which is devoted under each of those areas. So there is here a clear disconnection, which is essential in the exercise that we've done. I would like to spend the next 4 or 5 minutes, not to try to overrun too much, in making the comparison now between this output and, for instance, height. Thank you very much, Nicki. So in height, you actually have 3 categories. I'm only showing 2. So you have cropland and converted rangeland, which will correspond to the land use categories that we have in mind. There is also pastoralism, but interestingly, Hyde, I like that number. No, sorry, come back. Hyde only assigned 38 square kilometers of pure pastoral land for this time slice, which is perfectly in tune with the data. So that's why I'm not showing you, because we fundamentally have a map which is very, very white. But what we have done is to then amalgamate those 3 categories together. No, next slide, please, Nicki. And this is the total area under agriculture / pastoralism, so it's mostly converted rangeland, to use the Hyde categories. And what you can see are 2 things. First, and that's a direct outcome of the way Hyde assigns values on the map, it's a very continuous distribution, sorry. The other thing which is also very noticeable is that if you actually look at the values per se, which are expressed here, and you can see it on the legend, they are very, very, very low. So height, I think rightly so, consider that is actually a very limited amount of land per se, which is under land use at this time period. Where there is a discrepancy is in that the fact that it does it in a rather continuous way across all of Europe, whilst our approach is more of a clustered discontinuous. Next slide, please. So what you have here is the discrepancy and the overlap. So on the left, you have the overlap between height and or kernel density-based maps, and on the right, the difference. Overall, height tend to, we will consider it tends to overshoot by about 50% of the area. And I think that is just an outcome of the way height indeed works. It does not see, because of its architecture, clustering, which is one of the higher conclusion of our work, which is that the settlement is not actually evenly distributed all over across Europe. Next slide, please. And if we now split that very roughly in three areas, so you have the distribution of height versus the data at 90% probability or 75 probability for Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and Scandinavia. You can see that the discrepancies are pretty much the same. Heights probably overshoots a little bit more in Eastern Europe, or you can potentially say that it's actually the kernel density that underestimates here what is going on. It might be a reflection of the nature of the data that we've been using with our focus on C14. What is also very interesting is that Hein actually assumed that there's a little bit of converted rangeland happening in Scandinavia, whilst our data pretty much says nothing. But the difference is so minimal that the main message when it comes to the comparison with height is height does not see the clustering, but it is not meant to see the clustering because of its architecture, but it rightly assumes very limited amount of land use, which is, I think, a very good point. If we go now for the next slide, please. By comparison, ArchaeoGlobe, the difference is at two levels. Because of ArchaeoGlobe works at polygon level, rather than at starting from a point-based approach as we did, by definition, it cannot see any form of clustering as our data shows. So that is one major issue with the way the data is processed in ArchaeoGlobe, especially for these periods. Another problem lies in the nature of the classification used by ArchaeoGlobe. So for instance, when it says foraging hunting, it is really unclear if it's a binary definition by opposition to agriculture, or actually if it takes into consideration use of wild plants by population which are, however, using cereals. More importantly, is this distinction that ArchaeoGlobe does between extensive and intensive agriculture. And you can see that, for instance, extensive agriculture, defined as Sweden, shifting cultivation, non-continuous, is the type of land use that seems to be dominant according to the ArchaeoGlobe dataset, whilst actually the archaeological data and the work that we've done shows that much of the agriculture is small scale, intensive at level of garden plots. So here, and obviously the inverse conclusion works when you look at the distribution of the intensive agriculture in ArchaeoGlobe versus our data. So here there is clearly a problem also in the way ArchaeoGlobe tackles the types of land use. Next slide, please. So to conclude, what we've tried to do is a first comprehensive land use maps, and we've used, because of the nature of the local archaeological record, we've done it in a georeference way using chronologically secure data for the time window. The work that we've tried to do from moving from point data to a kind of area land use data offers an awful lot of exciting opportunities. And what is interesting is that obviously it's not perfect, but it corroborates very well actually with quite a lot of interpreted data set that we've been throwing at the results. It does offers a much better understanding of the viability of land use and how this variation is structured geographically and chronologically. Another key point is that many areas indicate that we have agriculture and hunter-gatherer foraging alongside each other. That is both an outcome of the nature of the window that we have been choosing, the chronological window, which actually corresponds to the transition in certain areas, but also most importantly, the fact that not only will you have the possibility of having communities practicing both land use in parallel, but also the importance of using wild resource even for societies that we would otherwise consider as agriculturalist. Another conclusion is that we have actually an extensive use of the landscape. And as I have just said, it does contrast relatively so with height and in particularly with Archaeoglobe, which both tend to overestimate. I think that the most important problem is that question of the nature of the land use categories, especially in the case of Archaeoglobe, which works at a very, very broad and kind of ineffective scale for this particular example. And in the main conclusion is that we are dealing with a very complex, dynamic ecological and agricultural systems that has an awful lot of implications in terms of food production, land use, productivity. So this work not only allows us to gather an awful lot of data and try to come with a comprehensive synthetic map, but also offer an awful lot of exciting opportunities to revisit land use in a much more thorough way. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nicki and Marc, for the very interesting presentation about the results of the European group. Is there any question?
You can use the chat.
Exactly.
Yeah, and you can continue to use the chat even when we continue with the program.
Absolutely. Well, I think that my takeaway point is the very interesting part related to the comparison with other approaches to understand land use. And I think that that's really important because in a sense, I think that part of the work of the land use group within LandCover6k is also to try to converge on approaches and methodologies that can be replicate and then do not have dissonance in a sense, something that, you know, it has been one of the major problems in such estimates. And there is key says something, food for thought indeed. Height needs to cluster its agriculture more, but what to use as mechanism?
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
a question probably for Marc.
That was my point, that I know that height now uses a combination of suitability maps, but I don't really have a mechanism to cluster my agriculture. And this might be some way of using these new kind of empirical data to steer height more into clustering. So I'm excited by this. Really, really nice.
So right now, I don't necessarily have an answer about how you could cluster, but I think that the next stage, which will be to check for systematic association with certain type of soil regime or hydrological regime. So something that will lead us towards the sort of the tools that, for instance, ecological species distribution model, and try to identify, even if it has to remain at a very, very general level, what are the main parameters underlying the distribution of those settlements might be a point to be taken into consideration.
Yeah.
Though obviously it might be very regional based.
Yesterday, like, okay, this is maybe something we ought to do, like a cluster analysis, but then based on the data you got, for example.
Yeah, I would agree with this, because I think a lot of this is probably being driven in part by soil, in part by topography. And it would be very, well, I think that's what we want to do, is to try to understand what's driving that. It's not going to be all environmentally driven, but if we can get a sense of that relationship, I think that would really help. And also, I guess, if we could start to move to other timeframes, that might help as well, to get a better sense of what might be driving at different periods, and if there are any general rules or not.
There's a question in the chat about the number of C14 dates. They are the dataset. So the dataset has actually a slightly shorter time frame. It's more than 4,000 C14 dates, and I on the top of my head, I can't remember the number of sites.
I think it's
but I can
1,700 sites or something.
Yes, that's the number I had in mind.
1,700 site, yeah.
Okay, I think that we can move forward to the next presentation, so to try to keep on the clock, and I'm pretty sure that we can have also further discussion at the end after the presentation of everybody. So the next is Jed Kaplan, and as I was saying before, not Ralph Fyfe that is ill, but Marie-José Gaillard, and it's Europe land cover, reveals KK and hide. That's for you. Marie-José will start.
Thank you very much. Jed and I, we wish to show you what we have done with the land cover reconstruction in Europe since 2017. So it's the second reconstruction for Europe, pollen-based. So next slide. So I just want to explain what are the land claim projects, because you have already heard this name the 2 first days, I think, by colleagues that think that everybody knows that what land claim is, but I suppose it's not like this at all. So it's 2 Swedish Research Council projects that deal with quantification of the biophysical and biogeochemical forcings from anthropogenic deforestation on regional climate, Holocene climate in Europe. So the first project was about 6K and 0.2K, and we used KK10 and hide for deforestation in climate modeling. And the pollen-based reveals estimates of open land were used for evaluation of KK2 and hide. This work is published in several publications, and you see the major ones here. So Strandberg et al., it's on the climate modeling. Then you have Vander et al., the reveals reconstruction, the work of Pisaman Benaz that Andrea talked about the other day on statistical interpolation of reveal estimate, and finally the comparison of reveals and hide and KK by Kaplan et al. So what is a land claim 2? It's a second project where instead of using KK10 and hide in climate modeling, we use the interpolated reveals estimates for natural and human-induced vegetation model in the climate models, and Gustav Strandberg will talk about this after us. So there are papers in review. The reveals paper by Gitumbi et al. Is in fact an open review until December. So if you want to look at it and have some comments and short reviews, you are welcome. And all of this is a contribution also to a long-term Swedish research area that is called MERGE, Modeling the Regional and Global Earth System, that started in 2010 and continues. So it's a very big thing that is coordinated from Lund University. Next. Jed? Okay, so the implementation of the reveals model uses this time the landscape reconstruction algorithm package that was written by Petr Kuněs in R. So it's a different code that it's the same equation, of course, but it's written in a different language than Shinya Sugita, and it's easier to use. So what is the process to implement reveals this time? It's to select the relative pollen productivity estimates and the taxa for which we will use reveals. And then we have to prepare the pollen records, all the pollen records we are using, and harmonize the relevant pollen productivities with all the pollen types that are in these pollen records. Then a new R code written by Ralph Fyfe is looping the reveals function in this package of PETCUNES across each grid cell to produce quantified vegetation. So this was a way to automatize something that we were doing by hand before. So Trontman et al., it was Florence Mazier and Annelie Posca and Ralph Fyfe and Anna-Kari Trontman that were doing all this work by hand. Next. So, and all this work by hand, you see, it was not trivial because we have to edit all pollen records so that they are harmonized to the plant taxa for which we have pollen productivities. So we worked with a list of all possible taxa that were in all the records we had. It's over 1,000 records for Europe. And we have to attach to all this pollen taxa the pollen relevant pollen estimate that is relevant for them. And you see, for instance, for next for taxon like Alnus, older, you had more than 40 ways to write this Alnus in these pollen records. So this was a work that we had, of course, to do by hand. So we had, of course, started earlier for the 2015 paper. It was mainly my work to harmonize all this. And now for this new one, it was Ralph and myself that did this. Next. So, and the reveals results can be aggregated to plant functional types and land cover classes. So this is one way to do it. So this is the way we used for this project, but one can do it in another way. And you see the plant taxa we are reconstructing by reveals in the right column. So I think I miss a slide, Jed, but it doesn't matter. The difference between LandClim 1 and LandClim 2 in terms of the reveals reconstruction is that Trontman et al. Is a reconstruction for 5 time windows of the Holocene and 25 taxa, I think. This time is for more than 30 taxa, and it's for the complete Holocene throughout from 11.5k to present in 500 years time windows and a bit shorter time windows near the present. Next. So this is just 2 examples of the results, and it's animation in both. So you have to look first at Fagus Beach. Now we are at 8,000, 7,000, 6,000, and you see how beach is migrating in Europe progressively from the now I'm tired, I don't find the word, from the south to the north. This is enough and open land. This is both grazing land and agriculture. And you see also how it changed from 11.5. Now we start 11.5, 8, 7, etc. Until today, and it becomes more and more dark green close to today. Next. This is also different than the
Yeah,
slide.
I just split it up. I split up. There's too much information on one slide. So
okay. So
the next slide is the one that has the time series on it. So we can introduce the time series and then talk about
okay, so this is density plots of the reveals estimates in all the grids. So when you have dark green for a percentage, let's say here it's an example where in many of the grids, most of the grids, you have 80% open land, while in the few grids you have 20% open land and it's yellow. Okay, so it's another way to show the data instead of showing them on a map. And it's very useful to find a baseline of openness, for instance. So I don't know for which it's for temperature Europe, this, okay. If you look at open land, you see that it's dark green. You can say between 5% or 10% and 20%, a long time. So this means that there is 20% open land even before Neolithic time, 6,000, in Europe, in many grids. So that's why I have given as a preliminary baseline for keys to use, that it's when it's more than 20%, he can assume that it's human impact from 7,000 something there, because we know that Neolithic started in the Mediterranean area about this time. So your turn, Jed, I think, isn't it?
Okay, thank you, Marie-José, and good evening from Hong Kong, everybody. It's almost 10 p.m. on Saturday night, so I'll do my best to try to keep you engaged, to keep myself engaged. I've stepped out of a holiday party, which I'm attending right now to give this talk, and then I will.
Thank you.
So. Marie-José gave you already a few ideas of the characteristics of the new, so the LandClim 2 reveals reconstructions, and this is just another way of looking at it. So this is really, we're getting ever closer to sort of true wall-to-wall coverage of Europe, at least of the Western and Central Europe, and you can see here that it extends from the Mediterranean right through to the Arctic Circle, which is really quite interesting. And also what makes this new reveals reconstruction so exciting is that it includes so many time slices. So the oldest plots are at the bottom here. The oldest time window is from 11,002 to 11,007. So it's really the very beginning of the Holocene, and it goes right through to the upper left there, which is 0 to 100. So I don't expect you to really be able to read the text on this slide from your computer. If you can, that's wonderful. But if you can't, basically just read from right to left and bottom to top if you want to go from the past to the present. And what you can notice here is what you also saw in the animation. In this case, this is the open land fraction that's being plotted, and you can see that there's progressively, in many parts of Europe, progressively more open land as time goes on. There is more open land also in the early Holocene, which Marie-José already mentioned. And the other thing to notice, which Marie-José mentioned, is that there is a significant fraction of open land that's really perpetuates through the entire period. So what we can do with this is we can start to look at these data and compare them with other data sets, with the ALCC data sets, for example. And here's Hyde 3.2 plotted for exactly the same periods. And well, I don't expect you to have memorized what you just saw in the previous slide, but you just get a basic idea from Hyde, which I think is not so unexpected, that there's a progressive increase in the open land or the land use fraction throughout the Holocene. We've already discussed this many times during the conference over the last couple of days. You can do the same thing for KK10, and you will see a similar trend, although with some different geographic pattern and some different timing. So there is a progressive trend towards more land use in Europe over the Holocene. The interesting thing here then is to compare reveals, these new LandClim 2 reveals estimates with KK10 and Hyde, and I would say that's non-trivial, but I'm showing you here some sort of preliminary analysis that we've done, where we have the reveal, so pollen on the x-axis and KK10 or Hyde on the y-axis. And what you're seeing here is a scatter plot where each color dot represents the field mean. It is the mean value of openness for all of the grid cells for which we have a reveals reconstruction at that time window. And so what you can see very, very nicely in this image is exactly what Marie-José was just talking about, the fact that reveals rarely has less than about 20% open land. Okay, so if you look at both KK10 and Hyde, and if you look at these dots, the dots more or less from bottom to top go in time order. I apologize that the legend is sort of opposite the way it's plotted, but nevertheless, the oldest time window is at the bottom and the youngest time window is almost always at the top in terms of open land in both KK10 and Hyde. In the reveals, it's a little bit more complicated, and you do see that feature that Marie-José already discussed, where there is more open land in the early part of the middle Holocene, I would say, then there is a bit less open land, and then increasing open land as you go towards the present. Now, the other thing to notice again, of course, is that in KK10 and Hyde, there's a prediction of rather little land use, but at the same time, reveals suggest that there is more open land than that. And I mean, in a way, that's to be expected. These results here have not been filtered in any way to account for the fact that there is naturally open land in Europe all the time. There are wetlands, there are heathlands, there are other formations that would alpine environments that would never be forested. And so it isn't really fair to make this comparison between KK10 and Hyde, which are meant to represent land use, and reveals, which is really meant to represent land cover. But it's just one way perhaps of looking at the data. So to sort of summarize, I would say Hyde is lower than KK10 and reveals. KK10 is a bit closer to reveals, but none of the comparisons is really very good. And certainly not at the grid cell level. If you actually, and you can see this if you just look at the sort of Iron Age, early Iron Age time windows, which are plotted on the right-hand side here. So we've got the 3K time slice if you want. And you can just by eyeballing it, I think, more or less tell that if you choose any individual grid cell, there isn't going to be a very good correspondence between either Hyde and reveals or KK10 and reveals. And part of that is based on what I already explained, that neither of the ALCC scenarios take into account the natural open land fraction, but then also, as we were discussing, as we already heard in the previous talk, for example, there are issues about the way in which these land use scenarios distribute land use in space. And so I think there's still some problems with the land use data, and we need to, as a road, we need to think about other ways of using this data, perhaps in a data assimilation form, although I think there's problems with that as well. We can discuss it afterwards, because that then takes away the opportunity we have to use reveals as a evaluation tool if we use it as data assimilation. So we use the data to inform the land use model, then we can't also use it to evaluate the model. So just to conclude then, and thank you for your attention, participation, I would say the major result we have here is that really enormous progress has been made in reconstruction of European land cover through the LandClim 2 project. I don't know, and Marie-José, you can correct me, I think there must be at least 3 times as many 1-degree grid cells in reveals 2 than there was in reveals 1, maybe even 4 times more. And it includes, of course, the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe, which weren't there before.
Twice more.
We're still, sorry?
Twice more grids.
Twice more, okay. So it's twice as many grid cells as
know
before.
about twice more pollen records also.
And so there's a lot more data behind it in general, exactly. We're exploring other ways to visualize the data and using time series, which you saw, and the comparison with the ALCC scenarios is ongoing. I think that the result is, it is what it is. I can't really say much more than that. I mean, I think we acknowledge that you cannot make an apples to apples comparison between these 2 types of data. They are fundamentally different. And so we have to think about other ways of using them. And we've got preview of that in Case presentation on Thursday, I guess it was, where he talked about how he's using it in the data assimilation form. And I think, is this a future? Perhaps. There perhaps could be other ways of using it as well. And that's something that's for open discussion and further research. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jed and Marie-José, for the very interesting presentation. And do we have question? I think there is a comment from Nicki in the chat. Nicki, do you want to take it up or I read it?
Yeah, it's just a comment that it would be really interesting to compare these open land areas versus these areas of archaeological activities, perhaps as a potential driver.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when coming back to the presentation that we had, was it yesterday, by the climate modelers, where they have the transient simulations of vegetation, we may be able to then just actually have a map of sort of the potential, by Anne Dahlmeyer, excuse me, but we have a map of the potential vegetation of Europe that goes all the way back to AK, and then that should give us an idea of what the actual sort of potential open land fraction could be like, and we can compare that to those archaeological reconstructions.
It's what we are doing a little bit with Anne Dahlmeyer,
right,
and Annelie, or for Europe. And of course, there are also problems because the dynamic vegetation models are not perfect, as you know. But it's really a question of model data comparison all the time, and back and forth, and improve on both sides, and it's the best we can do.
It's also an interesting question archaeologically, which is by the by, because there's been a long-standing discussion about these relationships, and we've never really, a lot of it is very anecdotal at the moment, so it would be quite interesting archaeologically as well.
Okay, thank you for the comments and the discussion, and I think we can now move to the next presentation from Gustav Strandberg, Regional Climate Model Simulation of the Mid-Holocene in Europe using pollen-based land cover. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll let you, the host has disabled screen sharing, so I think you have to redo that. I had to leave the meeting, so it.
You are now co-host.
Yeah. Yes, and now I trust that you see my presentation.
Yes, it's working.
Yeah, great. And I had a very long title, perhaps to match the long list of contributors to this. So there are quite a lot of different types of works put into this. And fortunately, we have already heard from Johan, Anneli, Marie-José and others, so I don't have to explain all the details in this. But I will talk about what you can do with these land cover reconstructions in terms of climate modeling. So the basic questions in this is on the general level. So what was climate like in mid-Holocene or 6K? And what was land cover like in that time? And then was there anthropogenic impact on the land cover? Or how large was it? Because we know actually that there was something. And how do the climate models respond to these differences in land cover? And in the end, is there an anthropogenic impact on climate already at 6K from land cover changes? And it turns out actually that already at 6K, there are some evidence that suggests that we have an effect on climate, at least in Southern Europe in summer. So what we see here, I will explain this a little bit more in detail later on, but what we see here is the difference in summer temperature between different potential vegetation and the reconstructed land cover that then includes also anthropogenic openness. And we see some differences here. It depends a little bit what kind of potential land cover you use and what model you use, climate model you use, but still we can see that the climate with the potential land cover is slightly colder. So then anthropogenic land cover changes would have led to slightly warmer temperatures, at least in Southern Europe, where we know that we have anthropogenic deforestation. So all of these differences is not, of course, because of anthropogenic activities. It can just be that the methods give slightly different results. So I will explain this a little more, so how this actually works from the beginning to the end. So we have to start with the global climate model, and that is easier in this case. So we have to consider the whole climate system, that is the whole atmosphere and everything. And the climate from the global model can be put into regional climate model. So when we model a smaller part of the Earth, we can afford more detail. So we have higher model resolution. And in this LandClim project, we have used 2 different RCMs. And because of that, you get 2 simulations of European climate, because all models will give you some different climate. And these climates then are put into LPGA GESS to simulate potential vegetation. So that's a consequence of the climate that we have. And that means that we will have 2 estimates of 6K land cover because we have 2 different climates. And if we take a look on these 2, now we call them L1 and L2 because it's from LPGA GESS, we can see that these 2, they bear a lot in common, but there are also some differences. So you can see that this area with the fraction of forest are up to 100% in Central Europe and to the Northeast. That is similar in both. So the overall patterns are similar in both these. But one big difference is in the Scandinavian mountains, where the L2 land cover has quite a lot of open land or bare ground. And now, to simplify this and not explain everything, I just show this as fraction of forest, because that is what matters the most in the climate model, actually. So there are, of course, a more refined picture of what land cover actually was like. Now, so since we have then 2 different land cover estimates of 6K, we can use them in the climate models. And since we have 2 land covers and 2 regional climate models, we will get 4 simulations of 6K climates. And to add something more and make things more interesting, we also take into account and reveals data and KK10 data. So we will have an estimate on the reconstructed land cover with openness. And that is put into the statistical model that Johan talked about yesterday. And then we will have a reconstructed land cover as a complement to the model from the vegetation model. And here we see the 3 different land covers that we use for 6K. And now you can see that there are a lot more open land in the reconstructed land cover, which is what we expect, of course. So you can still see this overall pattern, but you can also see that in the reconstructed is 0.1, 0.2 less everywhere, you could say, in the fractional forest. So since we now have 2 models and 3 land covers, we will get 6 different simulations of 6K climates, and that is what you see in the top table here. So for both of the regional models, we put in both land covers from the dynamical vegetation model and the reconstruction. And this is actually the first multi-member is perhaps a bit to stretch it too far, but at least 2-member RCM ensemble of the paleoclimate in Europe. For the pre-industrial period, we do similar thing, but here it's enough to just use present-day land covers, so we don't have to go through all this process of different land covers. And with all of this, we can study 2 things. And one is the difference between 6K and PI climates, and I will start with that. And the first thing we see is that 6K was clearly warmer than the pre-industrial climates. Now you should remember that these 3 climate models that we see here are not totally independent. So Easy Earth is used to force RCA4 and HCLIM, which are the regional models. So you can't expect them to be totally different. But especially in summer, where we don't have, when the weather is like, so we don't have this large inflow from the North Atlantic, the difference between the models, it's a bit larger, but still 6K is warmer more or less everywhere in all models in all seasons. For precipitation, it's not that as easy, so you can't say that it's always wetter or always drier, but at least we get a picture that is consistent between the models. So winter is mostly wetter, so 6K is wetter than pre-industrial time. And in summer, the north is wetter and the Mediterranean region is drier. And then the next thing that we can look at based on all this simulation is the response in the models to differences in land cover. And now you have to apologize for all the maps. It's a little bit complicated to have all these things. I hope I will make it understandable. So we start looking at winter temperature from the regional model RCA, that's top line, and HCLIM, the other RCM, in the bottom line. And the differences in temperature, that's what we see to the right. And now we compare then the climate in the simulation using the L1 and L2, so potential vegetation, with the reconstructed land cover. And we can see that these L1 and L2 simulations, they are mostly warmer than the reconstructed, except in the Scandinavian mountains. And this is very much connected to the differences in albedo. So with more forests, you will have a lower albedo, which means that you will get warmer or higher temperatures. And if you remember now, in the L2 land cover, we had a lot of openness in the Scandinavian mountains, and that's why we have such an increase in albedo and such a decrease in temperature. And since albedo is kind of a direct consequence of the land cover, they are very similar in both models, but the response to albedo differences, that could be different in different models. And now for the summer temperature, you see that the simulations with potential land cover is mostly colder than the simulation with reconstructed land cover. And that is to a large extent connected to evapotranspiration. So with more vegetation, you will get more evapotranspiration, which will cool the atmosphere a bit, giving you colder temperatures. And again, you can see the Scandinavian mountains. So here we have less vegetation in the L2 simulations, which will also have an effect, of course. And here, how the model responds in evapotranspiration from land cover changes, that is very different between the models. So that is how the model interprets or describes land cover. So here you can have large differences already in evapotranspiration, and then you will have a lot of differences in the temperature. And as I said in the beginning, all of these differences between reconstructed and the potential simulated land cover is not due to anthropogenic activity, but at least in Southern Europe, we know that that's a region where we had anthropogenic deforestation. So at least some of these differences in temperature is likely to be due to anthropogenic activities. So to sum this up, so 6K was warmer than pre-industrial time. 6K is mostly wetter, but drier in summer in Southern Europe. The differences between potential reconstructed land cover are large enough to have an impact on the simulated climates. So, and also that, or something that you conclude from that is that anthropogenic land cover changes could be large enough to have an impact on climate already at 6K. And the conclusion of this, or at least two conclusions of this, is that it's important to use proper land cover in your climate model. So land cover that is both realistic and consistent with the climate that you want to simulate. And also that it's important to use different climate models because different models respond differently to these differences in land cover. And the only way to estimate your uncertainties is to have more than one number. So if we have at least two models, we can see if they agree or when they agree or so on. And that's it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Gustav. And question, comment?
Gustav, could you say something on the, because now you have looked into, of course, mainly the biogeophysical effects, but can you say something general about the net effect of both geophysical and chemical?
Not
just a general, yeah.
Yeah, that's. I mean, we know that deforestation will emit CO2 in the atmosphere. So, I mean, that you could say, but we can't really study it in our models since we are using regional climate models. So then we don't take into account the entire atmosphere and all these chemical processes. So you can, I mean, based on this, we can just reason about it. The local effect and the global effect of deforestation is not necessarily the same, or probably they may be different. And the local effect on biophysical is also different between seasons and regions, whereas the chemical effect is always the same. So
yeah, it's what I wanted people to be aware of. It's why I wanted.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yes. Mm.
We all have different backgrounds.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think that now we kick in with the break. Let's say coffee break, bio break, any break you want to take. And it's going to be 15 minutes. So I'll see you all back in here at 15:30 my time, which is 14:30 GMT, and whatever other time is around the world where you're sitting at the moment. And so see you soon in 15 minutes.
And think to take some good thing to drink or something like that for the end of the session.
A good tea.
This is the opportunity.
Okay, then. See you soon, everybody.
See you.
here we are back. Still a couple of minutes to go at 15:30, my time. I don't have, oh dear. Can people hear me?
Yeah,
But okay.
it's snowing here.
Is it?
Yeah,
Oh,
it snowed here yesterday, earlier this week. I'm not used to this.
no.
It kind of sleets. You think, oh, it's going to rain, but it snows.
Oh,
Excitement.
the only two states in the US where it's snowing right now are Alaska and Hawaii.
Oh, seriously?
Hawaii. It's snowing in the high elevations on the big island of Hawaii, but nowhere else, which is very, very strange.
Mm.
There's been a big debate here about whether or not we had snow a month ago or whether it was just sleet. And if it was snow, it was the earliest snow they've ever had. And it's like, it's not snowing now. Does it matter?
Is it cold? Is it cold there?
It depends on who you talk to. I don't think it's cold, but everybody else is wearing giant puffy jackets.
What's the temperature?
They are not used to.
5, 6. Not
That's not
that
too
cold.
bad.
No. But
It's
I was
cold for
teaching
them.
the other day, and they had the heating on, they had the underfloor heating on, and the students were still sitting there in these giant puffy coats. And I was like, that's it. Somebody open a window. I can't cope with this.
You get people like
Underfloor
that
heating
here as
sounds
well,
nice.
actually. You get people either wearing their shorts in early October or they wear their puffer jackets. You've got these really contrasts.
Okay, 15:30 my time, so we get back on schedule to our talk. And the next talk we have is by Marie-José Gaillard, and it's first pollen-based reveals reconstruction of Holocene plant cover in Africa, a case study in Cameroon. Marie-José, all yours.
Thank you very much. So I am going to present a collaboration with Anne-Marie Lesin and numerous collaborators. So it's again, as many of the studies we have talked about during these 3 days, collaboration, fantastic collaboration. So, and it's also most of what I am going to talk about is it's just published in a volume of the Paleoecology of Africa that was edited by guest editors, and Marie is one of them. You recognize Will Gosling, probably, and Scott also. So chapter 12 is about this first reveals attempt at using reveals in Africa. So the background is a French-Belgian project in Cameroon on causes and consequences of the last great environmental crisis 3,000 ago, 3,000 years ago, in forest of Atlantic Equatorial Africa. So the objective of the pollen vegetation modeling in this project was to test Sugita's modeling approach in a tropical context to estimate the cover of major trees and herbs, and especially woodland versus open land. The question were what was the actual effect of the environmental crisis on the abundance of woodland versus open herb communities, and what were the actual changes in cover of major tree taxa, and how much do changes in pollen percentages differ from changes in plant abundance. Sorry, I have some troubles to. Okay, so first of all, very little work done in Africa so far in terms of modeling plant cover. So this is a map showing the number of studies of pollen productivity estimates in the tropics and subtropics. It's a synthesis that is in preparation and soon to be submitted. And you see that in Africa, there is one study in Cameroon, and it's the one I speak about with a red circle around. And then there are one study in Namibia and 2 studies in South Africa, and that's all. So few attempts at estimating relative pollen productivity so far, except this study that I present. These are the ones I mentioned. And you see it's 5 plant taxa in one case, 7 plant taxa in another, and 5 plant taxa in the third. So for the tropics, where there are so many species, you see at what stage we are. So the challenges are very similar to those that Michela Mariani presented yesterday for Tasmania and Australia. There are many taxa that are insect pollinated. The models used assume wind pollination. Much larger number of taxa, much larger number of taxa than Northern Hemisphere, and the collection of pollen and vegetation in field that can be logistically problematic. So here is the study region where you see both the samples or the location of the samples for the pollen productivity estimates study, and these are the small empty circles, black, and then the pollen records we had at that we had to do this study. We had 5. Here you see these are the squares, and I will talk only about B. This is with this yellow circle, and then Tilla, that is north of the detailed map, north of Balang. And these are the 2 sites on which we have applied reveals. Another challenge, as in other areas, is also the differences in altitudes. So here you see the 2 sites that I am going to talk about. B, that is located at 2,000 meter altitude elevation, while Tilla is in the plain. And you see also the different type of vegetation at this altitude. At B, we are in the Afro-montane forests, while in Tilla, we are in the wooded grasslands. So 30 modern pollen samples with related vegetation surveys for the ERV model and estimating relative pollen productivities for 12 plant taxa, and then 5 late quaternary sequences. So as I told you, I will show the reveals reconstruction for Tilla and the Afro-Montane forest in B. We have used also the other small, you see there is, Tilla is a large lake, B is a large bog. We have used the other records that are from the small lakes to apply the LAV model. The LAV model is estimating the cover of plants at local spatial scale. So this I will not talk about because of lack of time, but this is also in the publication I have showed you. So if you are interested. So these are the results of the relative pollen productivity estimates. So we recognize this kind of tables with all the taxa and poaceae, grasses, that is the reference taxa with 1 as relative pollen productivities. And in this case, you see that most taxa have higher pollen productivity than grasses. There is only Combretaceae, Melastomataceae, Cyperaceae that are lower with 0.5, 0.2. You have Moraceae also, 0.6. And Prunus africana, rubus, 0.4, and a very, very low pollen productivity for Podocarpus, and I have it in red here to show that this is a question mark, and I will discuss this later. So if we now compare these values with the very few other studies we have in the tropics. First, in Africa, if we compare, you see for Combretaceae, Melastomataceae, and Podocarpus, it's the only one we can compare. It's in the kind, it's below 1, you can say, for Combretaceae and Melastomataceae in the 2 studies existing, but there is a very big difference between the 2 for Podocarpus. And the value of 6.5 was in South Africa, was not known from us when we did this study. And this is a study that is published in the same volume as our study in this volume on paleoecology of Africa. If we compare with the other regions of the tropics, we have other values for Cyperaceae, as you see up there, in the same range of, I mean, the same magnitude. What is Moraceae? Here you have in our study 0.6, in Bolivia 0.25, in subtropical China 0.5, and much higher in tropical China, Hainan, 6.52. What can we compare more? Then it's Rosaceae, So in Cameroon, we have Protos africana robust, 0.4. Rosacea in subtropical China, so the whole family, 0.4, 0.8, 1. So it's, you see, there are values that are comparable, there are others that are not, as usual. So here I show the reveals reconstruction for the forest B site. So to show the effect of the pollen productivities, we have tested, because we understood that this very low pollen productivity for Podocarpus was not realistic, of 0.06. So we simply compared with using the pollen productivity of pine, but the Scott pine of Europe, that is 6.38, and also from spruce, 2.62. So you see that the very low pollen productivity estimate has as a consequence that Podocarpus is completely dominant in the vegetation cover in the reconstruction, and all other trees becomes barely represented in the cover. While when we use 2.62 and 6.38, it doesn't make so enormous difference, of course. Podocarpus is more has a larger cover when the pollen productivity is low, but it's not so different. And what is most interesting here is that the relationship between woodland cover and open land cover is different, as you see. And when 6.38 is used, which is very close to the value of Podocarpus that was obtained in Southern Africa, we have a significantly larger cover of open land. So then what other taxa are influenced? Podocarpus have a lower cover than in pollen proportions. Schefflera also, but Prunus, Nuxia, Morrison, and Combretaceae get a better representation instead than in pollen percentages. So, and same procedure for Tilla in the savanna region, and again the reveals with Podocarpus with low pollen productivity, we say it's not reasonable, but here it doesn't make so much difference because there was never many trees and shrubs in this landscape. But still, the most realistic reconstruction of the cover is thought to be the one where we have used 6.38 for Podocarpus. And again, you have some taxa like Macaranga, Celtis, and Alconea that are overrepresented in pollen proportions, while Morrison and Combretaceae, Melastomaceae are underrepresented in the pollen percentage. Okay, so to finish this, I just wanted to say that again, in this case, we have the plant cover that is both natural and human impacted. So again, we have to work with other disciplines, and especially archaeology, to disentangle the natural from the human. And already in 2013, Anne-Marie and colleagues, and with an archaeologist, looked into the temporal relationship between Holocene human occupation and vegetation change in this study region. But they didn't have the release estimate at the time. But nonetheless, you see here, I will not go into the details, but you can read this paper. It's very interesting. They conclude that looking at vegetation development from pollen analysis and plant macro remains from edible plants or cultivated plants and archaeological data, they can say that climate change impacted the rainforest well before the widespread expansion of human settlements all over this region. So you can see here on this diagram at the right that there are a few finds of plant macro remains of edible plants before 6K, but it's very, very low. But already in this record of Balang, you see that the pollen percentages of trees already decrease abruptly around 6K, and this is climatic, and this is the disruption of the forests in this region already during this period, and all through 3K, where this is this later very large decrease in trees in the region. But it's after this that you have the increase of, yeah. Okay, and next, last thing I wanted to say, that we can also compare with the work of Andrea Key, and I just show two of her maps. So the one at 1000 BC, that is about 3K. So you see that small scale food production is not yet in this area that was studied by Anne-Marie and collaborators. In a map in between, that is at 600 BC, it's what I show with the arrows, but I don't show the map. You have an extension of this yellow patch that comes into the region of the Les Inétals, but it's only around AD 200, that is about 1.8K, that we have some settled and diversified farming and yeah, settled farming. So there is a difference between these two studies, and it's interesting. So I will conclude. Sorry if I am too long. Pollen representation of taxa in relation to Poissé. You see here what taxa are overrepresented in pollen, with the new value of Podocarpus 6.5 in South Africa. That seems to be much more reasonable. And the taxa that are underrepresented, you see them here also. And for Africa, we have relative pollen productivities for 20 taxa. There are very few taxa that have two values, and even less taxa that have more than two values. So we are really at the start of using these approaches in the Southern Hemisphere. The RPP results in Cameroon agree with earlier knowledge on the modern pollen vegetation relationships in these vegetation types. And Podocarpus and Morrison provide contradictive results. So we have to live with this so long, but it is an observation that has been published earlier. The model approaches applied so far, mainly in the Northern Hemisphere, can also be useful in regions with a higher proportion of entomophilous species. And this is what Michaela showed yesterday for Tasmania and Australia. You can wonder why, because the models assume wind-transported pollen. You have to remember that the way we obtain these values with field data, pollen and vegetation, related vegetation, are in fact an estimate of pollen transported and deposited at a sample point, rather than a measure of true pollen productivity from the anthers. That is absolute pollen productivity. We had only one presentation about absolute pollen productivity yesterday. It was a Japan paper, maybe you remember. So it's a different measure. And what we find in pollen records is very much what is coming to the place with wind, but also with erosion and so on. So it's possible to use these models. It's simply to remember what are all the assumptions of this model and how much we don't meet the assumptions in the real world, and to produce as many values as possible so we can compare them and finally understand why they are different, because there are a lot of factors involved. So thank you very much for your patience. I haven't been too long. Yes. Sorry.
Thank you, Marie-José. Thank you so much. And any question? I see in the chat there is something. Okay. Thanks for the great presentation. Interesting result. Two observations from Anupama. Two observations. Do you have RPP values of Acacia albizia from Cameroon or elsewhere? It's interesting that Comrade Melastomaceae is underrepresented here.
I didn't understand the beginning. I read.
You can read the question.
Read
the question in.
Yeah. Do you have RPP values of Acacia albizia? No, unfortunately not. I've shown all the values we have. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. And the next one, James Todd, very interesting talk. Thank you. Is there published GIS paleoecological data for Eastern Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia? And I don't know.
GIS, what do you mean GIS?
GIS.
Yeah, but what?
Geographic Information System.
Yeah, I know, but what is meant with GIS?
Okay.
Paleoecology.
Maybe James can kick in.
I don't know, but
no.
No modeling in those countries.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Marie-José.
Paleoecology is yes. Mm-hmm.
Also, I think the results that are coming out from the work you've shown is very interesting from an archaeological point of view, because Central Africa, specifically in that chronological time frame, has seen a lot of human migration. And one of the main questions is if those human migration are related to an opening of the forest, or the forest changes before the human come in and actually allow the humans to come in,
Yeah,
or if
exactly.
it's the human population coming in and modifying the forest. So it's very
but this is the conclusion of Anne-Marie Lezine, of all the work she has done in Cameroon. It's that it's first climate, degradation of the forest, dead humans.
Maybe Bernard Keith could talk to that.
And yes.
Yep. You hear me, I presume, hopefully.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, well, just for a small introduction before I give a few thoughts and questions. I'm a bit new in this group. My background is Central Africa, archaeology, the Holocene, and personally, I prefer much more the Iron Age period than the Stone Age period. So,
excellent.
About the paleo environment, I know quite well because since the 1980s, I've been interacting with different people like Pierre Giresse or Jean Mallet and so on.
Yes, I know.
And also Marie Lezine, by the way.
Yeah.
So, a small remark about the Tila Lake tree profile with the Podocarpus. It's smack identical to the profiles we've got everywhere, i.e. you've got a lot of, well, increase of Podocarpus from 10,500 BP down to 2,500 BP, which is absolutely the same thing we've got everywhere in the Western Central African area. So it's completely normal what you have.
Yeah.
Second, the impact of the change in vegetation, climatic versus anthropic. We've been saying with what Anne-Marie Lezine has done, but also others like, well, we've got quite a few.
Yeah, sure.
2000 or so published, is that climate driven, full stop. A bit of a group of people being very, well, not serious, but on tech on this. Is climatic, is the humans didn't have anything to do apart from very small clearings around their villages, around their villages to have their charcoal and whatever. So the human impact is absolutely very limited. So it's climatic driven, and that's it. It's interesting because very recent, 1 hour ago, I sent off to the States to a colleague, an American colleague, what we hope it'll be the final draft, English draft of a paper which brings together all our radiocarbon dates catalog for Central Africa since 7,000 years ago down to the latest.
Great.
Full analysis of that catalog of between 1600 and 1700 archaeological dates. I'm not thinking of the paleo environment dates associated to pollen cores and things. So, well, that job is finished. The English version has been corrected, and we've got very interesting things in there regarding the Stone Age, regarding the Neolithic plus Iron Age periods. And we very lately, we zoomed on a very small area of Central Africa, which is what is for some people well known, the SRI, the Sangha River interval, which was presumed up to a year ago to have been covered at 2,500 BP by during the late Holocene forest crisis by a savanna corridor linking the northern savannas to the southern savannas, and which could have helped Iron Age people migrating through the forest from the Cameroon down to the Congo or Angola.
Okay.
The job is finished. I worked with Pierre Giresse and Jean Mallet on this. Jean-Louis Doucet also helped us with the botanical aspects of that area. He just tried southeastern Cameroon, southwestern Centrafrique, northern Congo. And the results, to put it in a very short thing, we got forest over there, no savanna. So the savanna corridor business can be trashed in a way. I'm a bit extreme thinking, but that's what we say in the paper. The manuscript is over. Next Friday or everybody will have inputted the tidbits to improve the facts. So paleoenvironmentally speaking, no savanna in the SRI, number one. And second, the earliest human settlements over there do not for sure exceed 2200 BP. That means that when villages, I mean, I'm not speaking about the hunter-gatherers, which were already there since 6,000 BP and over.
Yes, right.
When villages came over to the area, that specific area of Central Africa, Southern Cameroon, Southern Central Africa, Northern Congo, their cousins, let's say, which had started to move much earlier, were already on the Congo River and on the border of Angola. So the peopling by villages of that specific area of the rainforest was a very late business. But that means that you have several waves of villages going through the forest, some very early at 3000 BP. They were at 2200 BP on the Angolan border, and some others zigzagging through the forest much later.
Yeah.
Very interesting study, which had been a bit, it's not remembered by some, which were done by some linguists, archaeologists, others, geneticians about Gabon.
Yeah.
Is that through the different, through the centuries, they had several waves of immigrating people, villages, coming into Gabon from the north, then from the south, and so on. So that means you have a very complex picture of anthropic impact on the rainforest through time.
Right. Yeah.
And lastly, what we are saying in that paper with Gires and Mallet and Doucet about the SRI, we got a very nice picture putting together about, we've got 149 radiocarbon days for that small, what I call a small area of Central Africa. You've got a very low demography from the late Stone Age, then Neolithic, then early Iron Age times there, which is about the same thing everywhere in Central Africa. And then you've got a very high or higher demography starting during the late Iron Age, i.e. around 1200, 1100 BP. And you do have an impact on the forest. The pollen cores we've got in Southern Central Africa and Northern Congo do correlate with the archaeological data we have.
Yeah.
Full stop. That's it for the time.
Excellent. Thank you. Where are you going to submit this?
The SRI business, which is what? 50% paleoenvironment, 50% archaeology. That's the first time we bring together all that kind of data. That'll be in Quaternary International. They've accepted the idea of publishing it. Of course, it's going to go through the reviewer's business. And
yeah. But it's nice.
The catalog of Central Africa for the radiocarbon dates, hopefully, been accepted the idea in Azania, because it's very much archaeology oriented.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think we had the last.
May I ask you, because you have the BCLEST, what's your name?
Sorry, me?
What is your name?
You don't have it over there. Bernard Kleist. The B is for Bernard.
Oui.
Kleist, that's a family name.
Bernard Kleist.
Yeah.
Merci.
Small remark, Kleist is an English family name.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I was saying we can move forward in wrapping up a little bit all the conversation we've been having over the last 3 days, but also all the conversation that we've been having over the last several years. And I start sharing my screen. Is it visible?
Yes, so beautiful.
Yeah. Okay, good. So what I'm going to do very briefly and very quickly, because it's not easy in a sense to summarize such a long period of time of work, but I think that the general summary, you saw it already in all the presentations that have been going on during the last 3 days. This is an effort that we put together between Kathy, Nicki, and myself to a little bit say, what we are thinking that might be interesting perspective for the future. Let's see. Okay, so in the short term, we have two major dynamics that are still going on that are related to closing down the current on the way work and analysis, wrapping up the LandCover6k several years of work and focus on product output. And one of this is the PAGES scholarship that has been just awarded to Marie-José a few weeks ago, a couple of weeks ago, something like that, very recent. We got news from PAGES. And the other one is through an INQUA grant that we have, the International Focus Group, that we receive funds also to reignite, in a sense, some dynamics and some geographical groups, and again to fundamentally focus on some projects. So the PAGES Data Stewardship Scholarship fundamentally has been awarded to carrying out, summarize, and concentrate two main lanes in parallel. One is the pollen-based reveals land cover reconstruction with tables of plant estimate covers, statistical interpolation of reveals, gridded map of reveals over the Holocene through 25 time windows, and representation of change in land cover through the entire Holocene. And from the archaeology-based land use reconstruction, fundamentally summing up the worldwide PCLU, per capita land use data, and also wrapping up the various regions that have been intensively developed over the last few years: South Asia, Europe, China, and Africa. And you saw the results during the last 3 days, and this result needs to be fundamentally wrapped up and sent out. And so this is in the short term, from the PAGES side, and from the INQUA International Focus Group, the main point that we would like to develop at the moment is the bring together again the Amazon group and work a database and start the model for this region. And we've been delayed on this due to COVID. Fundamentally, it ended up in being, in the future, in the short-term future, simply because this was planned a year and a half ago, if I remember well, and then everything came to a standstill in terms of meeting, and we didn't think that having a meeting online would have been really useful from the experience we had with previous meeting, and so we decided to wait. Unfortunately, INQUA has been so gracious to extend the period of time in which you can use the grant for the meeting. But then the other things that we would like to do, where the next step obviously is going to be more focused on land use. That's a general idea that we are thinking to bring forward, and to more projects that are also of direct interest for the archaeological community, which does not mean by any means to move away from ALCC, but over these years we realized that there were so many questions that are key for archaeology and that we didn't have the time to explore, and that we think that's what would be a next step. So if it's a deeper understanding of the relationship between human activities, land use, and land cover, with implication for resilience of vegetation systems to human impact. So, but also a better understanding of the level of impact that we just really scratch on this, and how this translates into the vegetation, and how different social groups might create more or stronger, lesser or stronger impact on the vegetation through a direct link in examining the cultural data. For example, something that Nicki was saying about, what we see in the archaeozoological data from Europe that has been explored quite intensely. We see a lot of variation with the animal, as she showed in her presentation, but this variation in animals is also feeding directly information around the land cover. For instance, in Europe, dominance of pigs implies more woodlands in respect to dominance of cattle, where it implies a more open type of environment. So we think that we should go down that lane and explore more this kind of explore more the data with this kind of a perspective. Then, obviously, push the development of specific geographic area of sub-areas that have not been very developed up to now. And for instance, we have major geographical area that has been just scratched. For instance, we didn't do much work on North America. We did the Amazon partially, but we didn't touch very much the rest of South America. Russia, for instance, and Oceania. So, or part of Africa. Africa, there's been a lot of development, but there are still some parts, as in the presentation we saw yesterday, that still need some development there. So that would be an important push that we would like to see for the next step. Also, up to now, because of the way also LandCover6k was framed as a working group, and from the very beginning, there were time frame windows, very narrow window, in certain moments, 8,000, 6,000, 4,000, and that's what we concentrate at the moment. But in working with our data, we realize that also trying to do transient time frame will be very, very interesting to from an archaeological point of view, and so especially because as for example, the presentation from Nicki and Marc has clearly shown that sometimes the windows that were chosen in terms of archaeology create some problem, because they are just about set in a situation in which there are major changes in economies, but they are not picked up because of the window. And so having transient time frame will give us the possibility actually to exploit much more the data that's been collected. And as you saw in the last 3 days, there's been a lot of approaches that have been tested and tried, and have been developed in different geographical areas by different groups, Europe, China, and we would like that the next step is also to try to apply some of these methodologies into the other geographical areas, so that we can also start making comparison at global level. And again, this is a strand that we consider very important, because in a way, the approach we had up to now was to have the various groups working almost, I wouldn't say in isolation, but giving a lot of leeway to develop different methodologies. And now it would be interesting to bring all them together and see how they can be applied at a global level. Then we would like to further explore the database that the data set that they've been collected that are becoming extremely important data sets. So, for instance, exploring in the view of social dynamics, such as demography. At the moment, we didn't even touch that side, but it's clearly something extremely important, and it would be very interesting to have possibility to go down that line. Expanding for instance, using Bayesian approaches beyond the chronological one, even thinking about Bayesian approaches, for instance, for demography, or AI based training approaches that in many areas now they've been used in different ways, and like for instance from remote sensing and so on, and see if we can have this kind of approach to explore our data. And also potentially to think about broader patterns of how people make use of the landscape and how this might vary across space and time. I think there was an interesting, in Andrea Dozen's presentation on pollen, there was something that was quite interesting with respect to this point, in which she was showing, again, some Bayesian approaches with respect to time and space. And it could be something that would be quite entertaining to explore also for the archaeological data. And then finally, something that came up already in several of the presentations that were given, the relationship between the land use and geographical, topographical, geological aspects like soil, climate system, topography, hydrology. And again, this kind of thing, we are acutely aware that this kind of things are important, but we haven't really implemented them, we haven't explored them. And for instance, also Keith, when we were talking about height, was suggesting it was an interesting point to look at maybe in the next step. So, and also where all this data will end up. Well, as you saw for the Africa group, there are ad hoc GIS that have been developed, and which are very interesting, very useful, and then can also be deployed for the other group. But also we had recently we developed an agreement with SEED, which is the Strategic Environmental Archaeology Database, which is an international standard database for environmental archaeology data, which allows online storage, extraction, analysis, and visualization of data, and is based at the Umeå University in Sweden, and the key person is Steve Buckland in there. And this database will be very useful to finally have an open access to this data, and to be able to, for people to use the data eventually, and have different approaches, things that haven't been talked about in terms of LandCover6k. And so that's another strand that is going to be developed in the next step. At the moment, we are not announcing any new group because before doing any any further steps, as I was saying before, we want to really wrap up the LandCover6k and send out projects. But we will start to get together again in the new year and trying to form the nucleus of the new of a new, let's call it, working group. It could be PAGES, could be other within another umbrella. We still haven't decided exactly what would be in that sense, but there will be definitely more work in that in this sense. Also because a lot of groups have just started working, and it will be very interesting to see the development of that work. So obviously here there is a big thank you to all of you, to all the people that participated of the 7-year, contributed, discussed, criticized. Critics were very important to readdress problems. And we had several workshops, several online meetings, and several coordinating meetings. And when I say several, I'm talking about tens of meetings in various ways. But obviously, I think that an important thanks goes to the woman that also has driven this for a very long period of time, And thank you, Marie-José, to giving also us the energy when sometime wasn't there. And with this, I have finished my presentation and I stop sharing. And then I think that, you know, unless there is something from Nicki or Kathy that you want to add onto this, and forgot something or I didn't expand properly on something. Yes, Nicki.
Yeah, I just made a couple of comments in the chat about wanting to be able to compare with the land cover work, because we really haven't really had that opportunity, and I think that would be really interesting to be able to continue to do that, and also to continue to work with the modelers as well.
Of course.
The other thing I was going to briefly mention, which kind of has come out of a couple of conversations, and I didn't really mention it, but one of the things that sort of has come out from some of the work that we've been doing is actually around the role of wetlands. And I think how wetlands are being used, I mean, I'm specifically thinking about Europe, but of course, wetlands are very extensive all over the globe. It's fairly obvious that the use of wetlands is quite often quite different to many other parts of the a region. And I guess sometimes we are tending to, in the process of agglomeration, perhaps forgetting that areas of wetland may have been much more extensive than we have perhaps appreciated, and how people engage within those landscapes was probably quite dramatically different to the way they are in modern landscapes. And I suppose wetlands are an ecosystem which has been substantially transformed in the last sort of couple of hundred years. And I think we probably forget about them. And I think it would be a topic that I think would be really interesting to engage with, not just in terms of the archaeology, but also thinking about the global extent of wetlands in terms of thinking about how they might have varied in the past. And I know, because I also work in peatlands, I know that there is a need to understand historic distributions of peatlands actually, and where some of the carbon stocks may have been, where they may still be captured underneath drain landscape. So I think there are potential linkages that could be made.
Excellent.
Yes, Kathy.
Yes.
I think Marco did mention this, but just wanted to stress too that, of course, we have all these regional groups, and we saw, the wonderful presentations. And Marco mentioned that the Amazon group and several others actually that are sort of partially set up or just starting were delayed by the pandemic. So we have a little bit of a sort of backlog in terms of that, but we're also very interested in, linking up those areas. And we have, definite plans to make a more, continuous kind of data and maps. And also, as you also saw, and Marco just said, we've developed lots of methods for dealing with the really diverse kinds of archaeological records that we have, in a place like parts of Africa or parts of South Asia where there's very little information, whereas this place like Europe where there's a lot. We've had to, invent strategies for dealing with that. So we're also very interested in, writing that up in sort of the methodological terms and exploring some of those things. So we still, I say, have a lot to do in terms of the momentum of what we have done, but at the same time, as Marco nicely outlined, we're also thinking about, the future and how to kind of broaden our focus.
Thanks, Kathy. Okay, if there are not specific question or curiosity about the future, then I think I can hand over to Marie-José.